The parking lot outside my mother's house hasn't changed at all. Same cracked asphalt near the mailbox. Same dying rosebush my father planted the year I was born that nobody ever bothered to water properly. I sit behind the wheel of my car, engine off, watching the lights glow warm through the kitchen window, and I think about all the years I spent wishing I could be anywhere else in the world except here. Tonight is different, though. Tonight, I'm the one who chose to come back. My phone buzzes on the passenger seat. It's my sous chef checking in before Saturday's service. I tell him everything's fine, that I'll be back by morning. I don't tell him where I am. I don't tell him that my hands are shaking the tiniest bit, not from nerves exactly, but from the strange weight of a moment that's been building for 11 years. I take a breath, grab the bottle of wine I brought, and walk toward the front door. My mother opens it before I can knock. She looks at me the way she always has, like she's searching my face for something she expected to find there and keeps being disappointed when it isn't. "You look thin," she says. "That's how it starts. That's how it always starts." I need to go back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without it. My sister Claire is 4 years older than me and has been perfect for every single one of those years. That's not cruelty talking, it's just the family math I grew up with. Claire got straight A's without appearing to try. Claire was captain of the debate team, then valedictorian, then first in her class at Georgetown Law. Claire married a man our mother describes as distinguished and lives 40 minutes away in a house with a home office and a meal prep system and a calendar color-coded by category. Claire has never, not once in her life, made my mother worry. I was the other one. I wasn't a bad kid. I want to be clear about that. I just wasn't Claire. And in our house, that gap felt enormous. I didn't care about grades the way she did. I didn't thrive in the structured, linear way our mother understood and rewarded. What I cared about, the thing that pulled me completely, that made time disappear and made me feel like myself, was food, cooking. The way a kitchen has its own logic, its own rhythm, the way flavor is a language you can learn to speak if you're patient enough to listen. My mother found this ridiculous. Not at first she just ignored it. When I was 12 and started experimenting in the kitchen on weekends, she'd walk past and not comment. When I was 14 and began watching culinary competition shows instead of studying for tests I was going to pass anyway, she'd sigh and go upstairs. But when I was 17 and told her I wanted to go to culinary school instead of college, something shifted in her face. I watched the shift happen in real time, like a door closing. "That's not a career," she said. "That's a hobby." My father was quiet in the corner. He was always quiet when these conversations happened. He had a way of becoming very interested in whatever was on his plate when my mother made pronouncements about our futures. I used to resent that about him. It took me years to understand what it actually cost him to stay silent in that house. "Claire didn't waste her potential on cooking," my mother continued. And then the sentence she said so many times it carved a groove into me. "You are never going to match what your sister has built for herself. You know that, don't you?" She didn't say it to be cruel, I think. She said it because she believed it was true, and she believed it was a kindness to tell me early, before I spent too many years finding out the hard way. That's the thing about that kind of damage, it comes wrapped in love. It's so much harder to set down. I told her I was going to apply to culinary school anyway. She told me she wouldn't pay for it. I said fine. That night, my father knocked on my bedroom door. He didn't come in, just stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and a look on his face that I couldn't read at the time. He reached into his pocket and put an envelope on my dresser. "That's $3,000, he said quietly. "I've been putting it aside." "Don't tell your mother." I stared at it. "Dad, you're going to have to figure out the rest yourself," he said. "But I wanted you to have a start." He paused at the door. "I used to want to be an architect. Did you know that? Your grandmother told me it wasn't practical." He didn't say anything else. He just pulled the door closed softly behind him. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark and held the envelope against my chest and made myself a promise. Culinary school is not glamorous. I want to say that clearly because I know what people imagine: white toques, beautiful plating, someone narrating while you swirl a sauce. The reality is 14-hour days on your feet, burns on your forearms that you stop noticing after the third week, instructors who will break down everything you thought you knew about cooking until you're not sure you know anything at all, and then build you back up again from scratch. It is physically and mentally the hardest thing I have ever done. I loved every minute of it. I supplemented my father's $3,000 with 2 part-time jobs and a small scholarship the school offered for students demonstrating exceptional culinary instinct, which I'm still proud of because the competition was serious. I called home once a week. My mother asked about my grades in a way that made it clear she'd already decided they weren't going to be good. I told her they were fine. They were, in fact, excellent. I graduated 3rd in my class, but I learned early not to offer her that information because she'd find a way to reframe it. 3rd in your class isn't first. Your sister graduated first. I stopped needing her to be proud of me somewhere around my 2nd year. It happened gradually, then all at once. I woke up one Tuesday morning before a particularly grueling practical exam and realized I hadn't thought about her opinion in 3 days. It felt like setting down a bag I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it was there. After graduation, I moved to New York. I staged, that's the culinary term for working without pay in a professional kitchen in exchange for training in 2 restaurants in the city, sleeping on an air mattress in a studio apartment in Queens that I shared with a line cook named Deja, who is still one of my closest friends. I worked under 2 chefs who taught me more than I can explain here. I worked under one chef who was a genuinely awful human being who taught me just as much. I saved every dollar I didn't spend on rent and food. I called my father more than I called my mother. We'd talk about small things, mostly his garden, a documentary he'd watched, the neighbor's new dog. He never said much about my work directly, but at the end of every call he'd say, "Keep going, kiddo," in a way that meant something I couldn't fully name. My mother called less frequently. When she did, the conversation usually included an update about Claire, her newest case, her promotion, a vacation she and her husband were taking somewhere scenic. I'd say that's wonderful and mean it genuinely. Claire and I had our own relationship, separate from our mother's narration of it. Claire had actually called me during my 2nd year of culinary school and said, unprompted, "I think what you're doing is really brave." I'd been so surprised I didn't know what to say. After that, we talked differently. It took me 8 years from graduation to open my own restaurant. 8 years of staging, of line cooking, of working my way up to sous chef in a restaurant that got a write-up in the Times, of saving, of planning, of failing twice at the financing stage before I finally found the right investors and the right space. The restaurant is called Garnet, named for the color of a pomegranate seed, which was the first thing I ever cooked that made someone close their eyes, and it seats 42 people in a converted row house in Charleston, South Carolina. And from the first week we opened, I knew we'd built something real. I didn't tell my mother about the opening. I'm not proud of that, but I want to be honest. I told my father. I sent him the menu and a photograph of the dining room, and he called me that night, and I could hear in his voice that he was crying a little, though he'd never say so. "I always knew," he said, which wasn't true, but it was the kindest lie I've ever been told. My sister came to the opening. She drove 4 hours and brought her husband and ate the tasting menu and cried at the table in a way that made me have to excuse myself to the kitchen for 5 minutes to collect myself. She posted about it on Instagram with the caption, "My sister built this from scratch and I've never been more proud of anything in my life." It got more engagement than anything she'd ever posted. My mother did not comment. The review in Food and Wine came out 14 months after we opened. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't hoping for it. We'd been consistently full for 6 months. We had a wait list that stretched 8 weeks out. And I'd submitted the paperwork for James Beard consideration, which is an enormous thing that I almost didn't let myself say out loud because wanting it felt too large and too fragile at the same time. The Food and Wine reviewer had come in twice, which I knew because my front-of-house manager told me, and I'd made myself not adjust anything for those services because authenticity is the only thing that can't be faked across a tasting menu. The headline called Garnet one of the most quietly extraordinary restaurants to open in the South in a decade. They described my food as technically precise but emotionally present. They called out our pomegranate and lamb dish specifically, the one on the menu because of that first thing I'd ever cooked that made someone close their eyes, and they said it was the best single dish they'd eaten all year. My phone did not stop buzzing for 4 days. My father texted me a single line, "I'm showing this to everyone I know." I laughed so hard at that text I had to sit down on the kitchen floor. My mother didn't call. I told myself that was fine. I'd gotten good at that, at telling myself things were fine when they weren't, at building a life that didn't depend on her response to it. I had my restaurant, my team, my city. I had my father, my sister. I had Deja, who flew down for a long weekend and sat at the bar and drank through half our wine list and told me she'd known since the studio apartment in Queens that I was going to do something worth watching. I had enough. I knew I had enough. But the phone that didn't ring still rang in some quiet part of my head. I think it always will. That's the other thing nobody tells you about this kind of wound. It doesn't fully close. You learn to live around it. The call came 4 months after the food and wine piece. It wasn't my mother who called. It was my father, and he called on a Thursday afternoon when I was doing prep work for a private event we were hosting that weekend. His voice sounded different. Not upset, exactly, careful. "Your mother ran into Patricia Holloway at the club yesterday," he said. Patricia Holloway has been my mother's closest friend since before I was born. She's a woman who makes it her business to know everything about everyone. Patricia had seen the article. She'd saved it, apparently. She brought the magazine. I put down the knife I was holding. "Your mother didn't say much last night," my father continued. "But this morning she asked me for the address of the restaurant." I didn't answer for a moment. I was looking at the prep list on the wall, at the schedule written in my own handwriting, at the kitchen I had built from nothing. "What did you tell her?" I finally said. "I gave it to her," he said. "I hope that's all right." "Of course it is." There was a pause. "She's not good at this," my father said. "She never learned how to come back from being wrong about something." He said it simply, not making excuses for her, just explaining her as the person he'd shared his life with for 36 years. "But she's trying to figure it out, I think." I told him I'd call him on Sunday. I hung up and stood in my kitchen for a long moment, and then I went back to prep work, because the work was always the thing I came back to when I didn't know what else to do with my hands. She showed up on a Saturday evening. I didn't know she was coming. She didn't call ahead, which I think was deliberate, because calling ahead would have required saying things on the phone that she didn't know how to say yet. My front-of-house manager came back to the kitchen between courses and said quietly, "There's a woman at table 7 who says she's your mother. She doesn't have a reservation." I took off my apron. I washed my hands. I walked out. My mother was sitting at table 7 in the good dress she wears to important occasions. She'd done her hair. She had the food and wine magazine on the table in front of her, folded open to the page with my photograph, my restaurant, my words about why I cook. She looked up when I walked toward her, and I watched something move across her face, not quite guilt, not quite pride, something in between that didn't have a clean name. "I didn't make a reservation," she said. "I can leave if—" "You can stay," I said. I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Around us, the restaurant was doing exactly what it was supposed to do: full tables, soft conversation, the smell of something extraordinary coming from the kitchen where my team was running service without me for a few minutes. "I'll have someone bring you a menu." She looked around the room slowly, the way people do when they're trying to take in something they weren't prepared for. She looked at the design of the space, the lighting, the small details that had each taken weeks to get right. She looked at the staff moving through the dining room with the particular ease of people who love where they work. Then she looked back at me. "Patricia showed me the article," she said. "I know, Dad told me." She was quiet for a moment, her hands folded on top of the closed magazine. "I didn't know," she said finally, "about any of this. I didn't." She stopped, started again. "I didn't know you'd built something like this." "You didn't ask," I said. Not harshly, just honestly. She nodded once, like she was absorbing a small impact. "No," she said. "I didn't." What happened next is the part that surprised me. My mother is not a person who cries easily. I have seen her cry exactly 3 times in my life, and this was the 4th. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't make a sound. She just pressed her lips together very hard and looked down at the table, and 2 tears moved down her face in quick succession, and she wiped them away with the back of her hand like she was annoyed at herself for it. "I told you that you'd never match your sister," she said. "I said that to you." "You did." "I was wrong." She looked up at me. "I was wrong, and I said it like I was certain, and I'm sorry, Maya, I'm sorry for that." My name in her mouth, said that way, hit me somewhere I wasn't fully braced for. I'd imagined this conversation 100 times over the years. In most versions of it, I was colder. more distant. In some versions, I didn't let her in at all. But sitting across from her in the restaurant I built from $3,000 and a promise I made to myself in the dark, I found I didn't have as much anger left as I'd thought. Anger is expensive. I'd spent the last 11 years spending it on fuel instead. Tell me about it, I said. The article. What did you think? She blinked like she hadn't expected the question. Then she opened the magazine, carefully, to the page that had my photograph. And my mother, who had never once asked me about my cooking, started to read the sentences out loud. Slowly, like she was trying to memorize them. We talked for 2 hours. She didn't eat, she was too nervous to eat, I think. Though she'd never say so, but she stayed until the last table cleared out and the kitchen finished breaking down. I brought her a glass of the wine we'd opened for the private event, a bottle I'd specifically chosen because of the pomegranate notes. And she held it and didn't drink it for a long time before she finally took a sip and said, "This is beautiful." "I know," I said. "I picked it." That almost made her smile. There's something I need to say about Claire because it matters and the story isn't honest without it. When my mother arrived at my restaurant that night, she told me unprompted that she'd called Claire on the drive down, that she'd asked Claire why she'd never told her how well I was doing. And Claire, apparently, had said, "Mom, I've been telling you for years. You weren't ready to hear it." My mother sat with that for a moment and then said, "She's right, I wasn't." And I thought about all the ways we learn to protect ourselves from information that threatens what we believe. And I thought about my sister driving 4 hours to my opening and crying at the table, and I felt a complicated love for both of them at the same time. I asked my mother about the golden child dynamic not in those words, but directly enough. I asked her whether she'd known, when she said those things to me, how much damage they were doing. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I thought I was protecting you. From disappointment. From trying something that wasn't going to work." She paused. "I was protecting myself, I think. From the fear of watching you fail." "I wasn't going to fail," I said. "I know that now. I knew it then." I said it gently, but I needed her to hear it. I always knew it. That's the part that was hard, not the doubt itself, but that it was coming from you. She nodded. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked around the dining room one more time, slowly, at the empty tables and the soft light and the kitchen visible through the pass, where my team was cleaning down for the night. "You built something real," she said. It came out almost like a question, like she was still adjusting to the size of it. "Yes," I said, "I did." Before she left, there was one more thing I needed to do. I'd been planning it for months, actually long before she showed up at table 7, long before Patricia Holloway brought the magazine to the club. I'd been planning it since the first year Garnet turned a real profit, since the year I sat down with my finances and looked at a number that still amazes me and thought about everything it represented, about every decision that led to it. About a Thursday night when a man stood in a doorway and put an envelope on a dresser and said, "I wanted you to have a start." I went to the small office at the back of the restaurant and came back with an envelope. "This is for Dad," I said, and set it on the table in front of her. "He gave me $3,000 when I was 17. Don't tell him the amount in here. Just give it to him and tell him it's from me." She looked at the envelope without picking it up. "How much?" "He'll know," I said. "Give it to him with something from me. Tell him I remember what he said about the architect." She looked confused by that last part. That was fine. It was for him, not for her. She picked up the envelope carefully and put it in her purse. Then she stood. And we stood together in the empty dining room. And she looked at me for a moment with that searching look, the one she'd been wearing my whole life, except this time she seemed to find something in my face that she recognized. Something that fit. She hugged me. It was a little stiff, because she's never been easy with affection, but it was real. I hugged her back. "Patricia wants to come," she said into my shoulder. "She said she's been trying to get a reservation for 2 months. I laughed. "Tell her to call the restaurant." "I'll have her call the restaurant." That was 7 months ago. My mother has come back twice. The second time she came with my father, and I watched him walk through the front door of Garnet and stop in the entrance and look around the room the way he'd looked at the architectural drawings he used to keep in a folder in the garage with a particular quality of attention that meant something was being fully seen. He didn't say much. He came back to the kitchen and stood in the doorway. My father, who kept his dreams in a folder and put $3,000 in an envelope, and said, "Keep going, kiddo." And he looked at everything I'd built, and he had the same look on his face he'd had on the phone the night of the opening. I took off my apron and hugged him for a long time right there in the middle of service, and my sous chef pretended he wasn't watching. Claire came again too, a few weeks after that. Just the two of us this time, after service, sharing a bottle of wine at the bar the way we'd started doing whenever she was in town. She told me she'd had a conversation with our mother after the night at the restaurant. She said our mother had asked her whether she'd been happy, not accomplished, not successful, but happy, and Claire had said yes, but that it had taken her longer than it should have because she'd spent a lot of years trying to be the version of herself our mother needed her to be, instead of the one she actually was. She cried, Claire said, swirling her glass. Mom actually cried. I know, I said. I've seen it. It's 4 times for me now, Claire said. Sama. We sat with that for a moment, the two of us in the quiet of the restaurant after close, and I thought about the strange geometry of a family, how the same forces that damage one person can leave another standing, how love and harm can live in the same house for decades without ever resolving, how you can spend your whole life wanting something from someone and one day realize you don't need it the way you used to, and the want becomes something softer, more patient, something that can wait. I still cook the pomegranate and lamb dish. It's still on the menu. Every time I make it, I think about being 12 years old in a kitchen that wasn't mine yet, figuring out that food could be a language, that I had something to say in it. I think about the drawer where my first trophy sat unseen. I think about the envelope on the dresser. I think about my father saying, "Keep going," and how that was the whole instruction I needed. On Sunday nights, when the restaurant is closed, I call him. We still talk about small things, his garden, something he's been reading, the neighbor's dog who got older and slower but is apparently still very much alive. And at the end of every call, before we hang up, he says it. He's been saying it since I was 17. Keep going, kiddo. I always say the same thing back. I will, Dad, I am.